I want to look at a couple of texts before we begin. Let's go to Revelation chapter 13. This should be familiar with all of us. I want to look at the central verse in this chapter, and that is in verse 8, chapter 13, verse 8. And he says, "All that dwell on the earth will worship him whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world." This is the major issue of Revelation 13, of all of Revelation. Christ is the Lamb, and the enemy of God and man hates Christ. And so chapter 13 is talking about the great controversy between Christ and Satan. Christ is the Lamb. There's only one other time the Lamb is mentioned in this chapter, and we believe that was the United States. And if you go to verse 11, "Then I saw another beast coming out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb." And I'm not going to go any farther than that. This country was set up on two principles, represented by the powers of the horn, and one was Protestantism. And you remember what the other one is? The Republican form of government. These are the two principles. And this lamb was okay to begin with, but then later it turned into a dragon, speaking like a dragon. But I want to deal with the first part primarily. I want to go back to go forward to chapter 12. Backward to chapter 12. And in here, where verse 11 says, "They overcame him," this is the devil, "by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their own testimony. And they did not love their lives unto death." And then it talks about Christ being born, verse 13, and he persecuted the woman who gave birth. This would be the church and Christ. In verse 15, so it says, "The serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth." We believe that the earth that opened up was America. The persecutions and other things that were going on in Europe, you could not, even with the Reformation, because of the system over there, the divine right of kings was still embedded in the European thinking. Now, France had broken away, and the kings trembled for that, because they knew that if the United States was a democratic republic, and if France was going to be, that means they were all going to be overthrown. And in time, most of them were, not all, but almost all. And they really fought this for quite some time. But so what God had to do in the last days could not have been done in Europe. It had to be in a free country with the principles of liberty of conscience and justification by faith. These are the two principles all the way through the Bible. And even our own experience. When we're justified, we are freed experientially to either choose God or reject him. Well, I would say everyone has that freedom of choice, whether they serve him or not, the power of choice. And this government was established on those principles. What we're going to look at is some unintended consequences from the Reformation. Luther did not think all these things were going to happen. In fact, I don't think when he started, he wasn't even thinking of a Reformation. He was thinking of maybe reforming the church. But he saw some differences between those who were trying to reform it and the teaching of justification by faith. One time he said Wycliffe and Huss and Jerome, Huss I guess it was, that they all were trying to reform the church, but he said, I took the goose by the neck and got to the basis of it, which was the message of justification by faith. He said, I attacked doctrine. They were trying to reform by behavior, and he was getting to the heart of the matter. He knew that if the heart was captured, that the changes would take place, and that's what he was hoping for. But anyhow, here, the repudiation of either justification or liberty of conscience is a denial of the other. It goes both ways. If we deny liberty of conscience, we will deny justification by faith. If we deny justification by faith, we will deny the other. It's just, they go together. And now, the constitutional government of the United States of America was the political and the social consequences of the teaching of justification by faith. This is what came out of the Reformation, and it was established here. The American Adventism, we have the Declaration of Independence that led to the Constitution. From that, we have the Bill of Rights, and then last of all, but not in 1844, was the Three Angels' Messages. And this is where it was established to present to the world, actually. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights prepared the way for the Advent message of the proclamation of the everlasting gospel. It could not have been accomplished in Europe at that time. Now, this is the heart, it's the very core. Justification is the very core of the third angel's message. It starts with the gospel, the everlasting gospel, verse 6 of chapter 14 of Revelation. And verse 12 talks about the faith of Jesus. And so it permeates that message. It's the foundation of the three angels' message of that chapter. It begins with the gospel. I've already said that, so we won't spend some time on it. So what we have here, when Christ died, he emancipated the entire human race. Everyone has been freed. Now, everybody doesn't know that they've been freed, but that was he signed the emancipation papers for the entire race at Calvary, and it's our job to tell people that it's so, get them to believe it. And out of that came justification by faith. From that was liberty of conscience, and then you have the separation of church and state, and then religious freedom. All of this is based on Calvary. Now, justification by faith was accepted by some nations, and it was rejected by some. And those who accepted it was Germany, Netherlands, and England, and I should say Switzerland also was, I should have put that in there, but I didn't, and then ended up with the United States. Two nations primarily, maybe three if you include Portugal, but Spain and France resisted it fiercely. And it's interesting that these were major worldly powers. And when they rejected the message of justification by faith, the plan of salvation, they started going downhill. They started attacking their own people, and they started unwinding. They're still unwinding to this very day. And here's a nation that's called the Dutch Golden Age. They accepted, the northern part of the Netherlands accepted the gospel message. The southern part was controlled by the Spaniards, who they had control of the whole nation at one time, and they were trying to recapture it all the time. You have when Spain tried to capture England, it was twofold. They had standing armies in the Netherlands, and they were planning to have that armada come up to the Netherlands, pick up the land army, which they were a pretty powerful army. They were going to invade England. England was a Protestant nation. The Pope declared a crusade against England, and Prince Philip of Spain was going to carry it out. But as they pulled into the Netherlands, they pulled in there. The English were no match for the Spanish. No nation at that time was a match for them. And but have you heard of Sir Francis Drake? He was a pirate, and he would rob ships coming back, Spanish and Portuguese, coming back from Central and South America, coming with gold and silver, and he would pirate them and take the money from them and went on. But because he was such a good captain, the Queen of England decided to put him in the Navy, in the military, and it was his idea. He knew that these huge Spanish ships could not maneuver very well, and they were all bunched together. And so what he did, and he had other men that were involved in this, they would set vessels on fire and then push them toward the Galilean, these huge ships of the Spanish. Destroyed almost all of them. Now there were some that got away, but one of the problems that the Spanish did, they cut their anchor for some reason. I don't know why. They literally cut some of their anchors. And they decided they had to get out of there or they're going to be destroyed. So they went up north, the North Sea, and they were going to come all the way around and then back to Spain. They were defeated. Well, on the way up north, coming south, the wind started blowing in the Atlantic, and it drove many of them into the rocks, and many of them perished there. By the time this was over, Spain, the mightiest nation on earth, was totally defeated. Amazing. And then the next nation that really took place was the Dutch. The northern part, not the southern part. Many of the Protestants fled from the southern part to the northern part, and they got good jobs. They went into business for themselves, whatever they did, and they prospered. But they understood the idea of civil and religious liberties based on justification by faith. And they became a mighty nation. They were not a strong military one, but at one time they became the masters of the sea, building ships and trading with the Indies and India and the Spice Islands and things like this. They were on top of the world at that time. This was their golden age. And politics, it was a political model. They had a radical attitude towards religion in the country and a certain level of religious toleration. But they were a stable, thriving community economically. They had many artists and thinkers at that time, and religion and everyday life were recurring themes in their art. If you see into the art, it's usually things that people doing in everyday life. And here is this is when they declared their independence, and 1579. And here the Protestant was in the north, and it's the smallest part of the kingdom. And the southern part was extremely poor. They could never, it was because Spain had its control of them. They believed in the divine right of kings, and they could go nowhere. And so even some of the Catholics in the south went north because they knew the Protestants had it much better up there. And it was that northern part in the purple that became the great Dutch Reformation. Now, during the entire period between the early part of the 16th century to 1787, thousands of Huguenots left their homes in France. And if you picked up the history of the Huguenots, they were really the ones, the business people and workers in France. They were Protestant. They were of the Calvinistic persuasion out of Switzerland. But they were tremendous people, and they were persecuted by the king and by the church. And you've heard of the time when they decided to get rid of them all in one night, or as many as they possibly could. And they did it at nighttime. Tens of thousands of Huguenots were destroyed during that night. And even the Pope himself had a coin created celebrating the destruction of the Huguenots. And it was after that, and they've been fighting them for many years, but nothing like this. And so the Huguenots decided to get out of there. And when they went out, France went down. Economically, they were the backbone of their economy. And wherever they went, Switzerland, Germany, here the Dutch Republic, England, and the United States, they always left a footprint, a big footprint. And I'm going to put some people on the slide here a little bit here in America. But the Huguenots, wherever they went, they were a blessing to the people. Esther Forbes wrote a book called Paul Revere and let me see here, in the world in which he lived. She said, France had opened her own veins and spilt, the best blood when she drained herself of her Huguenots. And everywhere, in every country that would receive them, this amazing strain acted as a yeast wherever they went. And the Lord sent a few of them here to the States. They immigrated, I think I mentioned it, Germany, Switzerland, Holland, and England, and then finally the United States. They came from either directly from France or from the other nations before they came here. And just as France suffered a notable loss through the immigration of the intelligent, capable Huguenots, so the American colonies gained. And they became farmers, laborers, ministers, soldiers, sailors, people who engaged in government. The Huguenots supplied the colonies with excellent positions and expert artisans and craftsmen. Here are some of the Huguenots in America. Paul Revere, Henry Lawrence, who signed the Declaration of Independence. Alexander Hamilton was another one of the leaders of the United States. 8 American presidents: Washington, Grant, Franklin Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, William Taft, Truman, Gerald Ford, Lyndon Johnson, John Jay, who was the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. These were all Huguenots or had Huguenot blood within them. And they became, especially those at the time of the Declaration of Independence, they were pushing strongly for the separation of church and state and freedom of conscience. The exodus of the Huguenots from France created a brain drain, as many of them, they had occupied many important places in French society. And with the flight of the Huguenots, a general decline settled upon France. Flourishing manufacturing cities fell into decay. Fertile districts returned to their native wildness. Intellectual dullness and moral declension succeeded a period of unwanted progress. Paris became one vast almshouse, and it is estimated that at the breaking out of the revolution, 2,000 paupers claimed charity from the hands of the king. And you find that in Great Controversy on page 279. Okay, here we go again on this. Now, those who accepted it: Germany, England, and finally the United States. And this was a revolution against imperial and ecclesiastical injustices. Spain and Portugal and France rejected the justification by faith. France, in the revolution, again, they were against imperialism and ecclesiastical injustices. But theirs did not end in freedom. It actually they became terrorists. They call it the Reign of Terror, actually. And this is from the book Education. The spirit of unrest, of riot and bloodshed, the worldwide dissemination of the same teachings that led to the French Revolution, all are tending to involve the whole world in a struggle similar to that which convulsed France. Education 228. Do you think we're seeing that now? That's where we're at. Anarchy is beginning to rule in the world, and we're getting more of it right here in America. Some people seem to have lost their moorings altogether, and this is what God's people will face, and our young people are growing up amidst of this philosophy. Let's see. Okay, here. We're going to get it here. Okay. Again, to bring the point again, the United States was based on the separation of church and state, and from that came the personal liberties. The Reign of Terror produced communism and terrorism that we see in the world today. This came directly and indirectly from France. Now we come to the United States. To many in the Continental Congress, war was unthinkable. They argued over going to war with England for quite some time. And so why did they finally create this revolutionary document? You know, there's no document in the world like the Declaration of Independence. Nothing before that, and nothing since. And I believe that nothing will happen after this. In over 17 days, about Jefferson. Anyone remember how old he was when he first drafted the Declaration of Independence? 32 years old. It was a masterpiece. Of course, he'd practiced law for, I think, about 8 years or so. But some of the men, there were 3 or 4 men that were on that committee, and some of them were good writers, but they delegated that to Jefferson because he was a better writer than all of them. And it was a masterpiece. Now, they didn't accept everything that he wrote, and he got a little agitated over that. He thought they ought to accept everything, but they did most of it, or kept most of it. And he wrote what would become the mission statement for the Revolution and for a New Nation, which is the Declaration of Independence. And July 4, 1776, Congress voted the acceptance of that declaration. And this is you might get it and read it sometime. I can't. It's kind of hard to read there, but get it and read it. It's fascinating reading. God is mentioned several times in the document, and the second one is probably the second paragraph is probably more widely known than anything else. You have the preamble, and then this is the second paragraph. This is the one that we deal with quite a lot. And this is what they said: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, it doesn't say that that's all there is or are, but these are basic to every other liberty. And they have Creator in there, and they don't. People who are fighting the Constitution, many of them are fighting it because of the word Creator there and God or not the Constitution, but the Declaration. And they say, well, it's outdated, we can't. They don't believe it anyhow, so they fight against it pretty heavily. The whole issue, of prayer in school and all of this, I think we need to be careful with that. But part of it is because of this. They want God out of society. They want Him out of the schools. They want Him out of everything. And we see the mess that we're in because of that today. But anyhow, in this, the essence of justification by faith is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is basic to this. Now, this is what they were battling against, the feudal system. And in that, you have the peasants and the serfs. They were the money makers. They had to work the land, whatever they did. They were the producers. Above them, you have the knights and the lords. Above them, you have the nobles and the bishops. Above them, you have kings and queens. And then on top, you have the Pope. This is the feudal system. And there's no middle class. It's either extremely wealth or extremely poor. Most of your Central and South American nations are this way today. We, as the United States, are headed that way. I mean, there's some who are trying to bring us back to the feudal system. And I'm talking about politicians. I'm not a politician, but they are messing with the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Hopefully, there'll be some changes. I don't know. We'll see. But this is what's happening. And the feudal system is against a democratic Republican system of government. It cannot. The two cannot coexist together. They either have to be one or the other. And so some of the unintended consequences of justification by faith are the Protestant Reformation. As I mentioned, Luther did not intend for this to become as large as it was, even in his own day. But constitutional government. This was unheard of before the Reformation. You have divine rights of kings, and they sincerely believe this, that God ordained the kings, and the kings would keep people in line. And the papacy likes that because instead of, for years, they had no control over Americans because of crazy Protestants. They believed in intellectual freedom. And so they have hated this. They have fought it for at least 2 centuries. And since Vatican II, it looks like they've got a softer approach. But we need to be careful. They still believe the same as they always did. And they change not. That's one of the things with them. But anyhow, but constitutional governments came out of the Reformation, and separation of church and state, religious, civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, the right to petition, habeas corpus, trial by jury, free market system, capitalism, and economics. Some people, I had a lady one time walk out on me because I was talking about this. And I believe capitalism they've made some terrible mistakes, but it is based on it's a Protestant principle. And historians have seen that wherever Protestant, if they were true to their principles, they become thrifty. They didn't drink or smoke or did very little of it. And they were tremendous workers, and wherever they went, they prospered, such as the Huguenots. And then they saw the same thing here in the United States. And the papacy was totally against this type of thing because it didn't have the control. If you had the king and you have the people under them, and then you control the masses. They can't control the masses unless they have a system like the feudal system. And I think the word economics, came out of the Reformation. I don't think it was used before that time. Capitalism is the economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state or by the church. That's all it is. Now, capitalism has a bad name because you've got some that are filthy rich and they take it out on other people, and that ought not to be. But capitalism in and of itself is not bad, especially if it's controlled by principle. But if it's not principle, then you're in trouble. Capitalism was the economic practice of which Protestantism was the theory. Now, here's an interesting one. God, through Daniel, gave a prophecy for the last days to prepare people for the second coming of Christ. What was it? 2,300 days. You have the decree in 457 BC, the baptism of Christ. He was cut off, 31 BC. Stephen was stoned. That would be your 70-week prophecy of Daniel 9. And then the 2,300-year prophecy of Daniel 8. And of course, that comes down to the everlasting gospel, the pre-Advent judgment, the law of God, the faith of Jesus. And this whole prophetic movement was designed to break forth in the United States of America. God had to prepare the way for this movement to come into existence. And so to prepare for this date and message, God arranged for the setting up of a government that would allow the freedom to preach the message that closes Earth's history on sin. And this is where it is. That's where we're at even today. The date was the beginning of the three angel messages of Revelation 14. This message includes the everlasting gospel, the pre-Advent judgment, the call to worship the Creator. That's all in the first angel's message. It also talks about the fall of Babylon in verse 8. And then from 9 through 12, you have the warning against counterfeit worship. You have the law of God and the faith of Jesus. And the three essential founding documents of the United States government are the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And there's one more that is considered as a founding document, and that is the Monroe Doctrine. And I hope we can get into some of that today. But, you got it here. One of the documents that considered as that helped to build America. The Declaration, this is a rare Declaration of Independence. It's a picture of it. I don't have it. I wish I did. But anyhow, the Constitution and the Declaration, this is the Declaration when those men had finished the document, they handed over to the larger body, and it was voted on and accepted, even by those who didn't want to go to war, but they knew they had to retain the freedoms they had. They accepted that declaration. Okay, let's go here. This was the first ever in the world of such a declaration. We've already gone over that, so we won't spend time with it again. This is part of it also, where that to pursue these rights, or to secure them, I should say, these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect our safety and happiness. It was this part of the Declaration of Independence that the hippies and the yippies in the 1960s, they actually tried to destroy the government. And it was because of this statement in the Declaration that if the government goes astray, we have a right to tear it down and build it up again. But most of these did not have Christian principles or Protestant principles, and so it would have failed. But the group that grew up during that period of time, in fact, many of them were targeted by the government, and some of them went to prison, but they were slapped down pretty hardly. And so they decided to go underground. And many of the politicians, both Protestant and Catholic, both Democrat and Republican, when they went underground, they knew that in time they would be able to enter politics and change things. Part of that's what we're seeing today. The boomer generation, is it the boomer? Baby boomers, yeah. Many of these were involved in that thing during the 1960s. And some of them actually went to communist countries to learn communist ways of destroying things. And that's what we're seeing the results of some of these things today. And it's interesting to follow it as it unfolds. But that's what they were after at that time. The Constitution, here are some cartoons of different ones. The first one has to do with your personal freedoms. The second one is the right to bear arms. Of course, that one's under fire today. I don't own a gun, but I still believe it is a right that if people want to own it, they ought to be able to do it if they're not using it against someone else. And then you have the third one is the quartering of soldiers. The British would come in and say, "We're going to take your home. We're going to use it as a part of the defense of the kingdom." And then you got the rest. You're supposed to have search warrants to search and then arrest. And I'm not going to go through the rest of them, I think. But those are the first 10. The states demanded that there be a Bill of Rights. The federal men wanted, they say it's not necessary because all of these are contained in the Declaration and in the Constitution. And the state said, no, we're not signing this unless you have a Bill of Rights. These are individual rights. These rights were designed specifically to be denying the power of the federal government, the centralization of powers. And they got it, and they voted then for the Constitution, and we became a constitutional republic. Okay. The first two clauses of the First Amendment concern the relationship of government to religion. They call it the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And of course, this is something the papacy really wants. They want to be established as the religion above everything else. And then also, Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. That would be your liberty of conscience. So they're both there. So let's see. So long as their practice does not run afoul of public morals or a compelling governmental interest, they will stand. A wall of separation between church and state. Now, let's see, did we go too far here? I'm not sure. No, okay. These are the three powers that are against the faith of Jesus and liberty of conscience. You have American Protestants and Catholicism, and then we have the third one, which would be spiritualism, and all of them are after the third angel's message, Jesus Christ, the plan of salvation. This is what we're faced with, and spiritualism is going to take the day as time goes on. Here is something that Chief Justice Rehnquist stated while he was still alive and still in office. He says the wall of separation between church and state is a metaphor based on bad history. What do you think about that? This was a denial of the separation of church and state that the Constitution guarantees. Now, it does not state it explicitly, but the principles are there in that First Amendment, in the first two clauses of the First Amendment. And And what happens here, that these are foundation to all of that we have, religious and civil liberties, the separation of church and state. This is basic. And then you have the center pillar would be religious freedom. You have the freedom of the press, free speech, the peaceful assembly, and petition the government of grievances. These are pillars of our nation, actually. Now, what's happening? Some of them are attacking each of the pillars, but there's some are going to the foundation and trying to pull it out from underneath the structure. And so, if you have that taking place, well, maybe we'll get to it here in a little bit. You start pulling the foundation out, and everything else falls apart. And this is exactly what some are trying to do. And when you get to the end of that, you have tyranny. And that's, again, I've mentioned that's where we're headed for. Actually, we're already in the midst of it. I'm not going to do that. The Magna Carta was one of them that started in the 1200s with English. Let me see. But the blueprints of the American Democratic Republic are the Magna Carta, the Protestant Reformation, the founding documents of the nation, the three angel messages. And now we come to this. This pope was the one who was captured in 1798. This broke the back of the Catholic movement at that time. And here Berthier was took the pope captive. This man was put in charge. He was from 1800 to 1823, and he issued a condemnation against the Bible societies as a most abominable invention that destroyed the very foundations of religion. Now, it was his religion it was destroying. And after 1798, or just maybe a little before that, that's when your Bible societies started coming into existence here in America and in Britain especially, and then spread to other countries too. But he hated America. But this new era of liberty and republics had greatly diminished much of the papal power. Now, the Reformation had broken the back of the papacy, but then you had your Counter-Reformation, and they were beginning to swing back. And then you have the Methodist movement, the Baptist movement, the Presbyterian movement, and finally now we have the Advent movement. And I'm trusting that this will be the last movement before the Lord comes. It's supposed to be. Now, the papacy strongly hated these freedoms and was continually set on destroying them and on regaining her former absolute power as in the time of the Inquisitions. This is what they're looking for and wanting. Now, there was a secret treaty called the Secret Treaty of Verona, Austria, and this was 1822. Now, they'd been working on this for probably not 10 years, but for several years before this. And there were three primary nations that got involved in the kings of Prussia, Russia, and Austria. And behind the scene, this pope was helping them and pulling strings, hoping that they would. What they wanted was to place new kings in Spain and France, especially, again for power. And this goes back to 1814 and maybe 1812, but 14 and 15 is when they were in secret session, and it was a consequence of that Congress in Vienna. Now it's called the Holy Alliance. It was a coalition of Russia, Austria, and Prussia, created in 1815 at the urgent prompting of Tsar Alexander of Russia, and then signed by the three powers in Paris in 1815. And this was shortly after Napoleon met his Waterloo. To all outward appearances, it was to instill the Catholic values of charity and peace in European political life. Clemens Wenzel von Metternich from Austria made it also a fortification against revolution. They were absolutely frightened of revolution, both the French Revolution and the United States. And they thought everything was done. And so these monarchs got together, and the Holy Alliance was against all revolutionary democratic republics and secularism. It became defunct with Alexander's death in 1825. And here are some of the sovereigns of that alliance at that time. Let's see. Now again, they wanted to reestablish the divine right of kings. These are the three men that entered into that pact. Russia was the one, Alexander was the one that instituted it, the others went along with him. The man behind the scenes was the Pope. Now his name is not on any of the documents that came out of that, but there is letters from these men to him thanking him for the help that he gave them in this Congress. And so they were in the thick of it, working behind the scenes. And they're still doing it to this very day. Have you ever wondered why the Pope came here to the United States? It's for this very reason, to bring back the separated brethren, separated churches, and also to reestablish a different kind of government in the United States. Now here, this is, it was finally known in the early 1820s in the United States what they were doing. I wish to call the attention of the United States Senate to this treaty, because it is the threat of this treaty which was the basis of the Monroe Doctrine. It throws a powerful white light upon the conflict between monarchs and a government by the people. This was a senator by the name of Owens, and that was placed in the congressional record at that time, 1825. Now, the main concern of the Congress of Verona was to redistribute conquered territories, to create a balance of power, restore the pre-Napoleon order through King Louis the 18th, thank you, yes. So they wanted to put a monarch both in France and in Spain. Now, both of these nations had holdings in America. And so what happened, especially in Central and South America, when they saw what was happening in the United States, they said, we want to break from Europe also. We want to become a republic as the United States is. Well, they caught all kinds of flack from the mother nations. And they were going to march in with armies to retake them. This is part of that treaty in Verona. They're going to try to win back these nations here in the United States, not the United States, but in Central and South America. And they wanted to return the power to families who were running in 1789. These are the kings. And return to the Roman Catholic Church to its former power. So the secret treaty of Verona referred to all its participants as the Holy Alliance. The treaty was dedicated to the eradication of Europe's representative government and the reestablishment of absolute monarchies. It also proposed to suppress the press and to use religion to keep the nations in the state of positive obedience. The document signed in September of 1822 also expressed their thanks to the Pope for what he had already done for them. And this is the background of that. And now, it enabled war upon the people of Spain, and they wanted to prevent the exercise of any measure of freedom of speech or self-government. And in Italy, the same as in Spain, by sending Austrian troops to Italy. And they destroyed the popular movement in Spain and in Italy. A drastic suppression of the press in Europe by universal censorship. They killed free speech and all ideas of popular rights. There was complete suppression of popular government and by the people. Now remember, this was in the 1820s. This was just about, 30 or 40 years after the United States became a constitutional government. And they hated this too. Now, they laid their plans well to destroy the popular movement in Central and South America. These people had pulled away from them, and they were following the example of the United States. We find they're not following us today, but it's not altogether their own part, huh?
We are following them.
Okay, yes, that could very well be. Now, in between 1810 and 25, the War of Independence of Latin America took place. Chile, Peru, Argentina, and Mexico were released from Spanish dominion. And then in 1822, Brazil became independent from Portugal. Now comes the Monroe Doctrine. He was President of the United States during this period of time, and it expressed during his 7th annual message to Congress in 1823 the following, or this is a summary. If wars were to occur in the Americas, the United States would view such action as hostile toward itself. So if anything happened in Central or South America, then he said, you have a fight on your hands from us. And this caused them to step back a little bit. But here are some of the cartoons of that time, the 1820s. Here you see Uncle Sam as a rooster, and he has it's called the Monroe Doctrine. He had all the birds of Europe in the coop, in the chicken coop, and had them locked up. Here, this next one is another one. Uncle Sam was saying, "Don't you come over here." You see, he's got his hat on Central South America, showing that he was going to help them. Now, here, I really like this one. You heard this saying of drawing a line in the sand? This, I believe, is where it came from. And this was a cartoon dealing with that. And these were the nations of Europe who were trying to overthrow democratic governments. And behind these guys was the Pope. He was working behind the scenes. But when the United States took a stand on principle, then they backed away. And that gave breathing space for the Central and South America as well as the United States. We were not a major player in the world at that time, but we were moving in that direction. And the people didn't want to tangle with the United States. Here, this is in the 1900s. Teddy Roosevelt, his motto was "Speak softly and carry a big stick." But here he called on the Monroe Doctrine to put down things that were going on in the Dominican Republic and in Cuba. That was what that was about at that time. And this is the man. This is the man that was in the 1850s. He wrote his encyclical, and he said, "The absurd and erroneous doctrines of ravings in defense of liberty of conscience are a most pestilential error, a pest of all others most to be dreaded in a state." Now, why would that be? Pardon me?
That they can be kept.
Yes. Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier, if you have a bunch of people running around that are independent in their thinking, he can't control the masses. So he's got to bring a higher power to control everything. And that's what he was after. Oh, he had some interesting things. He also was the one who anathematized or cursed, that's another fancy word for cursing, those who assert the liberty of conscience of religious worship, also all such as maintain that the church may not employ force. This is, and I've got several of these popes during that time. I'm not going to go through all of them. This one was choice. He said, from which totally false idea of social government, they do not fear to foster that erroneous opinion, most fatal in its effects on the Catholic Church and the salvation of souls, called by our predecessor Gregory the 16th, and insanity that liberty of conscience and worship is each man's personal right, which ought to be legally proclaimed and asserted in every rightly constituted society, and that a right resides in the citizens to an absolute liberty, which should be restrained by no authority, whether ecclesiastical or civil, whereby they may be able openly and publicly to manifest and declare any of their ideas whatsoever, either by word of mouth or by the press or in any other way. And this is from this is what they call the Quanta Cura, which is condemning what they thought were current heresies at the time. And he was quoting another pope going back to the 1830s that was saying it was insanity to believe like this, to practice it. Now, it's apparent that he hated the constitutional rights of America. And the Constitution of the United States guarantees liberty of conscience, of religious worship, and of the press. In 1855, there's an engraving entitled "The Aim of Pius IX," and this was it was in the Library of Congress. I hope it's still there. But here you see him. Can you see what he's doing there? Let's see if I got will this do it? Where's the button? Oh, there. So he's got something in his hand, and he's trampling on something, and he's got a sword that killed a bird. That's the eagle, that's right. So here we've got his aim against the Constitution. He's going to tear it up, didn't want any part of it. And the U.S. flag, he was trampling on it. And then he killed the bird, which would be the eagle. The eagle, which was the standard of the United States government and separation of church and state, and liberty of conscience, freedom. Pardon me?
What year is this?
This would have been, he was in power in the 1850s. I don't remember now if to say the 50s. He was the one that declared in Vatican I that the Pope is infallible and that Mary was sinless and ascended to heaven after her death. He was the one behind all of this. And I don't remember when he died now. I should have had that on there, but I don't have it. But he hated this government. Now, this, and maybe we ought to close with this. There may be some questions or observations, but this is what we, if you take nothing from this except this, it'll be well worth it. If you would stand through the time of trouble, which is coming, you must know Christ. That's the essential principle here. Do we know Christ? And appropriate the gift of his righteousness, which he imputes to the repentant sinner. Review and Herald, November 22, 1892. But the main thing is to know Jesus Christ. And that takes place on a day-by-day basis. Our ups and downs and that sort of thing. But if we're taking time to commune with him, by beholding him, we actually become changed. And it may be not even known to us. Have you ever, when you were a kid, did you stand against a door frame and measure your height with a pencil? I did it when I was a kid. And you know, during the summertime, that's usually, it looks like that's the best time of growth. If you did that every day, there'd just be one dark line going up. You'd never see a difference. But if you wait for a few months, you can have a mark, and you go back, and sure enough, growing an inch or two. It's the same way with Christ. We may not be able to see our spiritual growth day by day, but we should be able to go back within months or a year or so, say, well, the Lord has taken me this far. He's delivered me this way and that way, and we ought to be able to do that. I'm not saying we need to spend a lot of time on ourselves studying our navel. I'm not saying that. But we ought to understand that God is with us and that he is growing us. It has to be his part. We have a part, yes. We surrender our wills to him. And I love that there's a statement in Volume 5 that as soon as we surrender our will to God, he immediately takes possession of it. And I know this to be true. I was in a hotel room one time, and there was a sin that I was very familiar with, and I kind of loved before, this is BC, before conversion. And this was after conversion, and this was after I was a preacher. The temptation was almost overwhelming. I almost broke over and started practicing that sin. And the Lord, I don't know what he did, but I had a determination in my mind. I got mad, and I said, I'm not going to do this. And immediately the power broke over me. And I have never been tempted on that again, in that manner. Been tempted, but not to the severity that it was that time. I was done. I knew I was done. Couldn't help it. I probably would have left, well, I don't know if I left the ministry. I might have, but I don't know. It's just, but God put a stop to it. I thank him for it. So merciful to us, and to me especially. But he is for us. He's not against us. And we let him have his way, he's going to take us right into the kingdom. That's where he wants us. The whole investigative judgment for his people, that judgment is for us. It's not against us. God is trying to save as many as he can.